Welcome back to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Victoria Bert. I'm the producer of this show. New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli released a report earlier this month to review the city-state's financial plan, and the report identified budget risks, underscored the need for federal aid, and further city action. Tom, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming here and giving us a little financial report card.
Victoria, thank you for always having me check in with you and your viewers. I really appreciate the great work you and the MNN team do all the time. Yeah. But as I mentioned to you before we started our formal chat, I've mostly been up here in Albany and was just in the city recently, hadn't been in for a while. But it's very clear, and our agency, basically our city office is not open, but it's an issue for so many of the businesses, especially in the office building. So many people are not back to work yet because there is concern about safety. We're not through the pandemic yet, but that has an impact on the city's economy and the state's economy and the revenue that comes to the city and to the state. And it underscores, as difficult as it is, to strike the right balance between social distancing, protecting public health, and getting people back to work so that we can start to see some growth in our revenue again, so we can start to see people going back to work. I'll mention the city issue you touched on, but just as a data point for your viewers, we've paid out thus far in New York State about $40 billion in unemployment benefits. And here we are, towards the end of August. For all of last year, all of 2019, we paid out about $2.1 billion versus $40 billion, and we're not even at the end of the year. It really underscores the economic damage at a personal and a household level, that we're facing. And just think, New York City, just look at the hospitality sector, the folks who work in the hotels, the folks who work in the restaurants. Look how they've been devastated. And New York City's reopening is obviously behind the other parts of the state. Look at the small businesses. So, our office in New York is down at Maiden Lane by the Federal Reserve. And when I was there the other day, we went out at lunchtime. Half the places were closed, and half of those had for lease signs, meaning they're never going to open up again. And what about the shoe shine, the dry cleaner, the dry goods? You just think about the multiplier effect of all this. So no surprise, the city revenues have been down, sales tax revenues, personal income tax, same thing for the state. The state, we did a quarterly report. Sales tax, second most important revenue source for the state, down 27% in the second quarter of the calendar year. New York City's were off by 35% compared to last year. Property tax, we don't have a state property tax, but the city and localities have it. Some people may not be able to afford to pay their property taxes if they're not been working. What happens to the building owners who aren't getting rent or commercial rent payments? What will that impact be? So the shortfall that the city has projected is real. Our concern that we identified, though, with the city's budget is that the way they're plugging the gap for this year is largely with one-time non-recurring actions. For instance, if you draw down money from some of your reserve accounts and you bring your reserves down to the statutory minimum, you won't have money in those reserves for next year. And they've also targeted certain savings that we think are problematic. So for instance, they talk about $1 billion in savings from labor. Well, but they haven't negotiated how they're going to achieve those $1 billion in saving, even with the issue of the police budget that's been, of great discussion, talk about reducing overtime by $350 million, but there's been no plan for how they're going to achieve that. So we saw a lot of budget risks that we think are significant. And again, if the economy doesn't start to open up again, the city is going to be facing some real challenges. As you know, the mayor's put out there the potential for layoffs of some 22,000 city employees. How do we avoid that? The big issue is Washington. Will we get more help from them? And that's been a big question mark so far.
Right. And now, outside of the sort of federal aid that could come, or the federal aid that hopefully will come, there's been a lot of speak about taxing, the 1%, the billionaire tax. There's many different ways that it's being discussed instead of cutting services, cutting jobs. Is that a realistic solution?
I think part of the problem is, given the enormity of the budget hole, you would probably have to have a tax so high, it probably would not be a tax that would come to pass. So could it help marginally? because don't forget, the higher income people already pay a higher rate, and they pay, I mean, there are different figures, but I think I saw something the other day that for the city, it's a little different than for the state. Those making $1 million or more, the tax revenue to the city is like over 40% of the overall burden. So there's already, arguably, they're already paying more. And there is some question about, especially in the COVID environment, people decide to relocate outside of the city. People in other parts of New York, people in other parts of the country. And so that, what's the breaking point where you will start to lose some of that? There won't be a net gain. My own view is that, look, if you have a budget hole, you either deal with it by cutting, you deal with it by borrowing, or you raise more revenue, raise taxes or other kinds of fees. The enormity of the whole, both for the state and the city, is that no one part of that is going to be the answer. I think what we need to focus on now, obviously always to be more efficient and smart in how we're spending, but we need to avoid cuts that will be onerous. Keep in mind, we're talking about the city budget, but the state budget, also revenues are down. The governor's talking about cutting as much as over $8 billion in local assistance. Local assistance is money that the state would send to New York City and to municipalities and schools across the state.
And who gets hit by that kind of cut?
Well, but that's the question, because it would really transfer the shortfall down to the local level. And so what would happen is that in the case of New York City, the mayor, working with the council, will have to come up with, where do you cut? I mean, the schools are already facing a lot of issues in terms of dealing with COVID. The city and local governments across the state are on the front line of dealing with the pandemic, trying to support the economic recovery. I don't know that there are too many areas that you can cut without some real pain out there. Look at the nonprofits that provide so many services. They're being hit very hard, and they're being expected to provide more services. The state is already delaying payments in local aid and reimbursing nonprofits. That's a delay that could turn into a cut. So, Victoria, I think the priority still has to be, until they say no, more help from Washington, because they just have the ability to provide resources. They have a printing press for money. We don't at the state level or the city level. We have gotten some money to reimburse for COVID-19 expenses, but we need money to repair the economic damage that resulted in these big budget gaps in the state budget and the city budget. I don't see, and that's just not just a New York issue.
Isn't this sort of all the unprecedented repercussions of this pandemic?
Yes. So, but the first reimbursement is for personal protective equipment, for ventilators. But, that's a direct reimbursement. Overtime spent for the people working in the health department. And they've given us money for that, testing and so on. But it's what you just asked. It's the collateral damage of the public health crisis, the economy put on hold and slowly reopening, the loss in revenue, what that's meant. A topic I'm sure you were going to get to, MTA. Look at the devastation there. People, was it 90% drop off in ridership on the subways at the peak of this? The trains, the commuter lines were like 75%. They've recovered somewhat, but they're, nowhere near. That's the prime, source of revenue for the MTA. So, Pat Foy has identified a shortfall over the next couple of years of something like $12 billion. How do you make that up? Are you gonna raise fares beyond what's already scheduled? Are you gonna cut back on service? I think he said the doomsday scenario is a 40% cut in service on the subways and the rail lines. How do you bring the economy back if people can't get to work?
Right.
Or if they can't afford to take the trains or the subways anymore? I hate to sound like a broken record, but we've got to get back to Washington providing more help. Will we get everything we've asked for and Governor Cuomo's asked for? Maybe not, but they can't give us a big zero because I don't know how we cut our way, borrow our way, or tax our way out of it without more federal help. I'm actually an optimist that we will get more federal help. It should have happened sooner than today. It hasn't happened today. It's got to happen tomorrow.
How did the DHS respond to your audit? I know that you found some significant problems in the homeless, in the shelter systems in New York. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So, we looked at some of their capital projects and what they needed to do to keep the shelters in good repair. The homeless question is an ongoing concern and a priority on many levels. But certainly if we want to have people feel comfortable in the shelters, they need to be safe, living conditions. And, what we found are too many situations where DHS, had inadequate plans that were delayed, cost overruns, no appropriate oversight for the contract work that was happening. As often happens with agencies, they'll say that, we're aware and we'll make improvements. I guess the good news is, they seem to be aware of the problem and they appear to be taking our recommendations seriously. But, these are not new issues. These are issues that have been out there. And given, the concern for homeless right now, the numbers seeming to go up or at least not going down, we've really got to make sure that the shelters are going to be safe enough that when someone is approached on the street to say, you need to be, in a shelter, or now that they're talking about moving some of the folks out of the hotels that they've been in back into a shelter, if you're an individual, if you feel you can't be in a safe living condition, why would you go there? So I'm hoping that they will, in fact, embrace our recommendations and really tighten up their operations so that the way they manage their capital improvements for the shelters, in fact, will be efficient, will be timely, and provide the kind of security so the homeless family won't feel unsafe in a shelter.
And it's also, if we look 6 months down the road, not that we have a crystal ball, but, we can assume that there might be a new homeless, in a sense, that people are losing their apartments, people can't pay their rents, people can't pay their mortgage. So, this is actually tied very deeply to what's happening right now, the state of how New York handles its homeless population.
Victoria, I think you're making an important point. We're looking at the crisis we're in right now, but I think what's most concerning to me is that there's no light at the end of the tunnel right now. And I think you're absolutely right. You could see a bad situation getting worse. Obviously the first imperative is to have that vaccine, right? Because then people will feel safe and secure, more likely to go back to work or go on a train or back to an office building or go out and spend money at a restaurant. But until that happens, you could easily see situations getting worse. And if in fact we have to absorb these huge budget shortfalls and they translate into budget cuts, essential services being hurt, people not going back to work, yeah. More homeless, absolutely. Issue of safety in the streets, what will that mean? We obviously have a lot of issues there that, continue to be percolating. Look, there's been a lot of talk about, New York, will it survive, giving up on New York. I'm in the camp that says New York, in fact, will get through it. We've gotten through a lot of tough circumstances before. But this is starting to really grip us in a way that, we should all really be very, very concerned. And you do have that disconnect with Wall Street lately seeming to do pretty well while Main Street is suffering so much. Mm-hmm. So I do think, I don't want to say like we're running on fumes for how strong we were in the beginning of the year, but there is still, I think, some of that. Look, the growth of the tech sector is an example in terms of the city's economy. Many of those folks may not be working in their office building in Manhattan, but they're still working because with technology they can work remotely. So I still think there are some opportunities there for resilience. And I do think all the things that make New York City great, as long as we can keep the reopening and do it safely, as long as the vaccine will be in the not too distant future, that will all come back. But in the short run, we have to look at the dislocations that are happening. We have to confront the social justice agenda. What's come out, in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing is forcing serious conversations. Just look at the results of the pandemic. Probably no one should have been surprised that disadvantaged communities of color, lower communities were hit harder in terms of the healthcare outcomes,
And can I also say that their jobs were the jobs that went away the quickest, right?
Yes. Yes.
Jobs that they couldn't work from home. So you have this whole community of people that are now not only not getting paid or are moving out of the city. So it's sort of an interesting correlation that you made about, the wealthy leaving New York City. You also have this working class that could be leaving the city.
Leaving the city if they can, although in some cases I bet it's harder for them to leave. They may not have they don't have the second home in the Hamptons to go to, and they may or may not have family, options. It's not so easy to move south anymore because many of the southern states are having a terrible problem with the pandemic, worse than we're having here in New York. How many folks that are in Florida would rather be in New York right now, as an example? So, it's a very complex and very troubling set of circumstances. But I think we need to stay positive. We need to stay focused on a bipartisan basis. I know we're in a very partisan climate right now with the election, but we need to remind the folks in Washington, it is not a red state or blue state issue. Those states, in the red states that opened up too fast, they're having to now close their economy again. They're having budget shortfalls like we're having. It is in the national interest to deal with the state financial crisis and also not leave out local governments like New York City. If we really do believe we're all in it together, there has to be continued support and certainly continuing to look out for the enhanced unemployment benefits for the people, as you point out, that haven't been able to work. Support for the small businesses so they get through this tough time and can hopefully reopen again. If there was ever a time that we needed government to be working at full throttle, it is now. And I just wish that more of the folks in Washington would embrace that spirit and understand it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.